The afternoon sun dipped lower as Mike and I trudged through the overgrown trails. We had ventured far into the woods of Nova Scotia, determined to find a scenic hiking route that wasn't overrun with other hikers. It had started as a perfect day, blue skies, crisp air. But as the light faded, so did our sense of direction. We didn't mean to get lost, but now it was undeniable. The path we were on didn't match the one on the map. The forest felt thicker than it should have, like the trees were slowly closing in around us, amplifying the crunch of every misstep. We kept going, hoping the woods would open up again. They did, but not in the way we expected. A wide clearing spread out before us, revealing what looked like an abandoned farmstead. The paint on the barn was peeling, and the field fences sagged under the weight of time. A rotting wooden sign hanging crookedly by a wire read, Summerview Farm. It was clear no one had tended to the place in years. "Looks like we're staying here tonight," Mike nodding toward a small cabin on the far side of the property. The cabin's front door groaned open with a reluctant creak, releasing a puff of stale air. Inside, it was dusty but oddly preserved, like someone had left in a hurry and never returned. A small table stood in the center of the room with 2 wooden chairs, both pulled out as if ready for guests. The place gave me the creeps, but we were exhausted and had no better options. We unrolled our sleeping bags by the old stone hearth. I noticed something strange while arranging my things. Footprints. Fresh footprints. They stood out against the dust like silent accusations, leading from the doorway to where we had set our gear. But no one was here, and no other belongings suggested anyone had been around. Probably our own tracks. Dust moves weird sometimes, you know? I wasn't convinced, but exhaustion outweighed paranoia. We decided to stay and make the best of it. Night fell quickly, and the forest seemed to dissolve into the shadows beyond the windows. We were halfway asleep when it started, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the steps were too heavy, too measured. They circled the cabin once, then again. The sound of footsteps dragging over gravel sent an icy shiver down my spine. I nudged Mike, who was now wide awake, his eyes wide with alarm. We both knew what the other was thinking. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. Maybe someone's lost, just like us. We stayed perfectly still, hearts pounding in unison as we listened. The footsteps paused at the front of the cabin. Then, as if whoever was out there knew exactly where we were, they stopped right by the window nearest us. The silence that followed was worse than the sound of movement. It was intentional, calculated. I strained my ears, convinced I could hear shallow breathing from the other side of the glass. But when I dared a glance, there was nothing, just the thick blackness of night pressing against the window panes. Neither of us slept much after that, jumping at every creak of the cabin's wood and every distant crack of a twig outside. Somehow, the hours passed, and the first light of dawn trickled through the gaps in the curtains. We both let out a breath we hadn't realized we'd been holding. Morning felt like an escape from the nightmare of the previous night. We packed up our things in a hurry, eager to leave Summerview Farm far behind. But just as we were about to head out, Mike noticed something strange. Did you move this?" I turned to look. Our things, the sleeping bags, the backpacks, even the water bottles, had all been neatly arranged in a row by the fireplace. They hadn't been that way when we woke up. Everything was laid out with meticulous care, almost ritualistically, as if someone had been preparing for our arrival long before we showed up. That was the moment it hit me. This place wasn't abandoned at all. Someone had been expecting us. I glanced at Mike, and the same realization was dawning on him, the color draining from his face. We had been watching all night, not by some lost hiker or curious animal, but by someone or something patient, and waiting. We didn't speak another word. It was supposed to be a casual night hike through the dense forests of British Columbia, just me and my friend Nate. The trail was supposed to loop back to our campsite, an easy walk under the stars, but somehow the woods around us seemed wrong. The air felt unnaturally still, and every rustling leaf or snapping branch sounded louder than it should have, as if the forest itself was listening. We were about an hour into the hike when we first saw the lanterns. Nate was the first to notice them, a faint, flickering glow bobbing gently between the trees ahead. "Looks like we're not the only ones out here tonight," he said, motioning toward the lights with his chin. It made sense at first. Maybe some other campers had wandered off like us. But there was something strange about the way the lights moved. They didn't sway naturally, not like a person walking with a lantern. Instead, they floated too smoothly, gliding just above the undergrowth without a single stumble or pause. "Should we check it out?" Nate asked, his voice unusually hushed. I hesitated but nodded, curious and uneasy in equal measure. It was better to walk toward light than wander aimlessly in the dark, right? We followed the lanterns deeper into the woods. As soon as we took a step closer, the lights drifted away, just out of reach. The glow pulled us farther and farther off the trail, slipping silently between the trees, as if guiding us deeper into the forest's belly. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Something didn't sit right. The farther we walked, the more the familiar world dissolved behind us. I turned around once, hoping to spot the trailhead or even a break in the trees, but all I saw were shadows, endless and thick. I felt a chill creep along my spine. When had the forest become this dense? There was no moonlight filtering through the canopy anymore. Only the lanterns remained, swaying in the dark like distant promises. "Hey man, you think this is weird?" I didn't answer, but I could tell he felt it too. The unease sat heavy between us, unspoken but undeniable. We pressed on though, because that's what you do, right? You assume there's a logical explanation. You assume it's fine. We followed the lanterns deeper into the woods for what felt like hours. And then they stopped, just like that, hovering over an empty campsite. There were remnants of a campfire, cold and scattered. The embers were long dead, but the ashes had been brushed into neat piles, as if someone had cleaned up in a hurry. Two tents sat side by side, their fabric walls flapping softly in the breeze, but no one was inside. No gear, no backpacks, not a single trace of anyone, just emptiness. Nate glanced at me, his face pale under the flickering light. "Where is everyone?" I had no answer. The silence was thick, wrapping around us like a wet cloth. It was too quiet. No crickets, no wind in the branches, just the faint crackle of leaves beneath our boots. And then the lanterns began to move again. At first, they drifted lazily around the abandoned camp, as if waiting. Then, without warning, they shot off into the forest, faster this time, their glow shrinking in the distance. Should we keep going? Everything inside me screamed to turn back. We should have stopped. We should have left. But instead, we kept walking, because people don't admit they're scared until it's too late. The lanterns danced ahead of us, teasing us deeper into the forest's labyrinth. I glanced at my phone, hoping to check the time or map our location, but there was no signal, not even the flicker of a weak connection. The knot in my stomach tightened into a ball of ice. "Do you smell that?" I sniffed the air. There was a faint, sickly sweet odor, like rotting fruit mixed with damp soil. The smell coiled around us, thick and suffocating, clinging to the back of my throat. We pressed on, though. We always pressed on. It wasn't until the lanterns vanished completely that I realized how lost we were. They winked out in an instant, plunging us into suffocating darkness. One moment, they were there, and the next, nothing. Just blackness as deep as the ocean at night. I could hear Nate's breathing now, fast and shallow, matching my own. Panic clawed at my insides, gnawing at reason. I pulled out my phone again, shining the weak flashlight in every direction, but all I saw were trees and shadows, stretching infinitely. What now? Before I could answer, we heard it, a low rustling, like something dragging through the underbrush. It came from behind us, a slow, deliberate sound, as though something or someone was moving closer. We spun around, but all we found was more darkness. Just the endless forest, pressing against us from every side. I wanted to scream, to run, but fear rooted me to the ground. And then I saw it, something pale glinting between the trees. It wasn't a lantern. It was a face. We sprinted through the forest, blind and desperate, tripping over roots and branches. The lanterns didn't return. We ran until our lungs burned. until the trees blurred into a suffocating wall of black. We never found the trail again. The forest swallowed it whole. When the first hint of dawn bled through the trees, we collapsed in exhaustion by a stream we didn't recognize. The campsite? Gone. The lanterns? Just a nightmare we would never escape. And as we sat there, catching our breath, I realized something chilling. Whatever those lanterns were, they hadn't led us astray. They'd been leading us exactly where they wanted us all along. The night stretched long and empty as I drove along the back roads of southern Nevada, my GPS flickering between directions and a no-signal message. I was miles from the nearest town, with nothing but my headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The road was so desolate it felt like I was the last person on Earth, just me and the hum of my engine. I glanced at the dashboard. Midnight. There were still hours to go before I'd reach the small, run-down motel I'd booked along the highway. The road ahead twisted like a coiled snake, with no end in sight, and the landscape around me was flat and endless, an ocean of black sand and dry scrub. Then, out of nowhere, a burst of static filled the truck's cab, and a voice crackled through the walkie-talkie sitting on my passenger seat. "Hey, you out there?" the voice asked, calm and low, as if it already knew I was listening. I stared at the walkie-talkie in disbelief. I didn't own one, had never touched it before, and I sure as hell hadn't brought it with me. It must have been left in the rental truck by the last driver. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, just pretending I hadn't heard anything. But curiosity gnawed at me. I picked it up, thumb hovering over the button, and hesitated. The night outside seemed darker now, the road narrower, as if the walls of night were closing in. Before I could respond, the voice spoke again. "I know you can hear me. You're on County Route 36, right?" The voice was steady, casual, too casual. It knew exactly where I was. I dropped the walkie-talkie like it burned my skin, and it clattered onto the seat. A sick sense of unease crawled into my chest, knotting tight beneath my ribs. I hadn't passed anyone for miles. No houses, no cars. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning pale. I kept my eyes pinned to the road, willing the walkie-talkie to stay silent. "You need to keep moving," the voice instructed, cutting through the static. "Do not stop." My heart drummed harder, thudding against my ribs like a warning. How did they know where I was? And why told me not to stop? I wanted to respond, demand answers, but fear glued my hands to the wheel. The landscape blurred past in the darkness as I pressed my foot harder on the gas. The truck's engine growled, climbing higher and higher into the gears. Every instinct screamed at me to listen to that voice, as ridiculous as it was, but a voice coming from a walkie-talkie that shouldn't even be there? I told myself it was a prank, some freak coincidence, even though I knew deep down it wasn't. Then I saw it, a car parked haphazardly by the side of the road, its windows shattered and body scarred with dents. It looked like it had been sitting there for a while, forgotten in the middle of nowhere. Something about it was off. The headlights were dark, the front tire flat, and yet the sight of it made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Against my better judgment, I slowed down as I passed the car. That's when I saw the most unsettling detail. The driver's door was open, hanging ajar, and there was no one inside. Just an empty seat and shattered glass sparkling on the asphalt. The walkie-talkie crackled again, startling me. I glanced down at it. "Do not stop," the voice repeated, sterner this time. "They never make it if they stop." A knot of cold fear settled in my gut. The road felt like it was folding in on itself, twisting deeper into some place that wasn't meant to be found. I kept driving, faster now, my foot heavy on the pedal. The truck's headlights clawed at the darkness. But no matter how far I went, the road kept stretching endlessly ahead, as if it would never end. "Almost there," the voice whispered through the static, oddly soothing. "Just don't stop, no matter what you see." I wanted to scream, to hurl the walkie-talkie out the window, but the fear had taken root inside me. It wasn't just the road or the strange voice. It was the way everything around me seemed wrong, as if the landscape had shifted just slightly off-kilter. Then, in the distance, I saw it, another abandoned car identical to the first, Same model, same shattered windows. The driver's door swung wide open, as if waiting for me. Panic gripped me hard, twisting my thoughts into tangled knots. I slammed on the gas, the engine roaring as I sped past. I knew, without a doubt, that if I stopped, I wouldn't be leaving that place alive. The voice spoke one last time, quieter now, almost drowned out by the static. They never make it, not if they stop. And then, silence. The walkie-talkie went dead, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the endless stretch of road. I drove through the night, never slowing, never daring to pull over, even as exhaustion gnawed at the edges of my mind. When the first pink slivers of dawn began to light the horizon, I finally saw the neon sign of the motel flickering in the distance. I pulled into the parking lot, heart still hammering in my chest. The sense of relief should have washed over me, but it didn't. As I climbed out of the truck, I glanced into the back seat. The walkie-talkie was gone. Just a quick way through the edge of farmland to get back to the trailhead before nightfall. But something about the cornfield didn't sit right. The stalks were impossibly tall, swaying just slightly, as if they were leaning in. The air was still, too still, and no insects or birds stirred. Only the occasional shift of dry husks whispered through the silence. Each step deeper, feeling like it took us further from the world outside. There were 5 of us, me, Tim, Mia, Rachel, and Derek. By the time we reached the field, twilight had already started to creep in. Rachel insisted it was faster this way, said she'd done it on another hike. We followed without argument, wanting to save the extra hour. The chill in the air made the idea of wandering after dark sound worse than taking a shortcut through unfamiliar territory. Tim took the lead, his flashlight cutting through the narrow rows. The corn loomed higher with every step, and soon it felt like the walls were closing in, swallowing the outside world entirely. No distant hum of cars, no sounds of life, just us and the stretch of dirt path winding deeper into the field. "Stay close," Tim said, holding the light steady. We moved in silence, single file, the only sound our footsteps crunching against the dry earth. Every now and then I glanced back to make sure everyone was still there, but the path behind us always seemed different. The rows shifted subtly, like the maze had reformed when I wasn't looking. Mia noticed the first trail, a deep groove carved into the dirt, as if something heavy had been dragged through the corn. It curved inward, winding away from the straight line we had been following. "We should take it," Rachel said, stepping closer to the trench. We hesitated but gave in. Better to follow a trail than wander aimlessly. We moved down the narrow path, each step growing heavier with unease, like the field didn't want us there. That's when the first flashlight flickered. Tim shook it, but it sputtered and died. Mia tried her phone, but there was no signal. No map, just the glowing screen reflecting back at us from the endless walls of corn. Then the sound started. It was a rustling, slow and deliberate. Not the wind, something else. It moved with us, slipping between the stalks, following close enough to keep pace. I stopped. "Do you hear that?" Everyone went still. The field seemed to hold its breath along with us, waiting. And then a voice drifted out from somewhere in the corn. "Over here." It was Tim's voice, low and familiar. Tim froze. "What the hell?" The voice called again, slow and patient. It sounded like Tim, but something about it was off, like hearing a recording of someone you knew, just slightly distorted. "Who's there?" Rachel asked, her flashlight trembling. The rustling picked up, closing in. We bolted, sprinting down the narrow path, the dry stalks brushing against our arms like fingers reaching out to grab us. Then Derek was gone. One moment he was with us, running close behind, and the next his footsteps just stopped. "Derek," Mia called out, spinning around. Only silence answered. Then, from somewhere in the maze, his voice drifted toward us. "Help me," it called, soft and coaxing. "This way. I'm right here." Rachel shook her head. "Don't go. It's not him." Mia took a step forward, but the voice kept calling, drawing closer. There was no urgency, no fear, just a slow, steady insistence. We ran again, the path twisting beneath our feet, the cornrows tightening around us. It felt like the field was shifting, reshaping with every turn, dragging us deeper. The voice followed us, steady and calm, always just out of sight. "Don't leave me," it said, mimicking Derek perfectly. We tried to double back, but the paths had changed. Our footprints in the dirt didn't lead back the way we came. They circled ahead of us, guiding us deeper into the maze, as if we'd been walking in our own steps the entire time. Rachel's flashlight flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. In the last flicker of light, I saw him, Derek's silhouette standing in the path, still and waiting. And then everything went dark. The night stretched out long and lonely as I drove down the deserted highway. The kind of road that feels like it belongs to no one, just endless asphalt and the faint hum of tires against the cracked pavement. The clock on the dashboard flickered past midnight, and I still had hours to go before I reached my destination. The radio sputtered between static and songs I didn't know, but I kept it on, needing some company in the silence. Every so often, the headlights would catch on twisted road signs and the occasional skeletal remains of old billboards, their faded words eaten by time. That's when I saw him, a figure on the side of the road, thumb out, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. I don't know why I slowed down, but something about the way he stood, head tilted as if he'd been waiting just for me, made me ease my foot off the gas. I pulled over, the tires crunching against gravel. The hitchhiker stepped forward into the glow of the headlights, a man in his mid-30s, wearing a black jacket zipped up to his chin. His face was calm, expression unreadable, like he didn't expect me to stop, but wasn't surprised either. I leaned over and popped the passenger door open. "Where are you headed?" I asked. He slid in without hesitation, setting a small backpack at his feet. "Just passing through," he said in a voice that was too smooth, too practiced, like he'd said those words many times before. I shrugged and pulled back onto the highway. The silence between us stretched out, thick and heavy, the kind that grows when two strangers are trapped in the same space. I kept my eyes on the road, hoping the miles would melt faster if I didn't think too much about who I'd just let into my car. After a few minutes, the hitchhiker shifted in his seat. "Ever hear about people who pick up hitchhikers and never make it where they're going?" he asked, voice low and casual, as if we were chatting about the weather. A cold knot twisted in my stomach, but I forced a chuckle. "Sounds like an urban legend." He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, could be. But it's funny how many stories start with a ride just like this." The headlights stretched out ahead, revealing nothing but more highway. The moon hung low, a dull crescent, barely offering any light. I tightened my grip on the wheel, trying to shake the strange weight settling in the cab. I decided to play along. "So, what happens to the people in those stories?" I asked, pretending not to care too much about the answer. His gaze drifted to the window, his reflection smudged and distorted in the glass. "They just keep driving," he said, as if the thought amused him. "No matter how far they go, they never seem to get anywhere. Just mile after mile, the same stretch of road looping endlessly." Something about the way he said it made the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The road outside suddenly felt unfamiliar, even though I knew I hadn't made a wrong turn. I glanced at the GPS on the dashboard. It showed the same highway number, but the estimated arrival time kept increasing, as if the destination were sliding further away. I shook off the unease. "Sounds like a nightmare." I muttered more to myself than to him. He chuckled softly, a sound too hollow to be real. "Yeah, a nightmare you don't wake up from." The highway stretched on, bending through endless black. The gas gauge hovered just above half, but something told me we'd been driving longer than it seemed. I felt trapped in that car, the weight of the hitchhiker's presence pressing against me like a second shadow. That's when I noticed it, the rearview mirror. I glanced at it out of habit, and my heart skipped. The hitchhiker's reflection wasn't there. I snapped my eyes back to the passenger seat, but there he was, sitting calmly beside me, hands folded neatly in his lap as if nothing were wrong. My pulse roared in my ears. The road felt heavier now, the air inside the car thick and suffocating. I fought the urge to slam on the brakes and force him out, but something told me it wouldn't make a difference. He turned to me, as if sensing my panic. "You don't have to worry," he said quietly, with that same unreadable smile. "We're almost there." "Almost where?" I didn't ask. I just kept driving, the road stretching endlessly before us, the same mile markers ticking by over and over again, like the world was folding in on itself. The headlights cut through the dark, but there was no end in sight. Only more highway, the same lifeless scenery repeating like a broken loop. And when I looked at the rearview mirror one last time, I saw it. The passenger seat was empty, but I knew he was still there. A quick night hike through the dense forest, a loop that would take us back to camp before it got too late. Just me and Nate, cutting through the trails of British Columbia under a sky full of stars. But even from the start, something felt off. Like the woods had become heavier with each step, the air stagnant, and holding on to too much silence. We were about halfway in when we first noticed them. The lights. "Check it out," Nate said, tilting his head toward the flickering glow just ahead, bobbing between the trunks of pine trees. The lights looked like lanterns, floating low and steady, moving without any sway. It didn't make sense. They hovered too smoothly, slipping through the trees as if nothing could slow them down. "Think it's other campers?" Nate asked, shifting his backpack. I glanced around at the thick shadows curling between the trunks and gave a quick nod. Better to follow a light than wander aimlessly in the dark, right? As soon as we stepped toward them, the lanterns drifted further into the forest, just out of reach. They didn't seem in a hurry, though, just guiding us deeper, gliding through the black in a way that almost felt deliberate. The farther we went, the less familiar everything became. Trees closed in tighter, blocking out what little moonlight remained. The ground underfoot grew softer, like the earth had been left untouched for years. I turned around, hoping to see some glimpse of the trailhead, but all I found were shadows. Nate shot me a glance over his shoulder. "You sure this is the right way?" I didn't answer right away. Something had sunk into the pit of my stomach, something cold that gnawed at me the longer we walked. But we kept going, because what else could we do? You keep moving forward when there's no way back. Then the lights stopped, suddenly, without warning, hovering just above the ground, flickering against the darkness. They floated over what looked like an abandoned campsite. We stepped into the clearing cautiously. Two old tents sagged inward, their fabric whispering softly as the night breeze ran through them. A campfire pit sat cold in the middle, the embers long dead but swept into careful little piles. No signs of people, just the eerie remains of something left behind. "Where is everyone?" Nate asked, running his hand along the edge of one of the tents. I didn't know what to say. The emptiness here felt intentional, too clean, like whoever had been here wanted us to believe they were never coming back. Before we could think too hard about it, the lanterns drifted again, moving quicker this time, pulling us deeper into the forest. Nate glanced at me, as if waiting for a reason to stop. But we followed, because that's what you do. You trust the light when you have nothing else to guide you. We kept walking, and the forest closed in tighter. The air smelled strange now, damp and sweet, like decaying fruit mixed with something sour that stuck to the back of my throat. "Do you smell that?" Nate asked, sniffing the air, his face wrinkling in disgust. I nodded, though I didn't have a good answer. Something about the smell wrapped around us, choking the words we wanted to say. And then, without any warning, the lanterns blinked out. 1 second, they were there, and the next gone. The sudden darkness was complete, like someone had dropped a curtain over the world. I reached for my phone, the weak flashlight trembling as I aimed it in every direction. Trees. Just trees. They stretched endlessly in every direction, turning the forest into a labyrinth. "We need to go," Nate whispered, his voice edged with tension. We turned back the way we thought we'd come, but nothing looked the same. Every path twisted and turned, folding in on itself, leading us nowhere. Then, out of the stillness, came the first sound, a low, deliberate rustling in the bushes behind us. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it knew exactly where we were. Nate and I spun around, hearts hammering against our ribs. The forest pressed against us, the silence stretching thin until I thought it would snap. And then, through the tangle of branches, I saw it. Something pale, a glint of a face that wasn't ours. We ran. The lanterns didn't return, and the forest twisted tighter with every step. The path underfoot seemed to shift beneath us, dragging us in circles, no matter which way we turned. My lungs burned, my legs heavy with exhaustion, but we kept going because there was no other choice. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the canopy, we stumbled into a stream, gasping for air. The forest, as thick as ever, loomed behind us, silent and patient, as if it had all the time in the world. The campsite? Gone. The lanterns? Just a fading nightmare. And as we sat there, catching our breath, I realized something with a weight that chilled me to the core. They hadn't led us astray. They'd brought us exactly where they wanted us. The neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly as I pulled into the lot, its glow barely cutting through the night. It was the only building I'd seen in miles, slouched at the edge of the highway, waiting like it knew someone would have no other choice. I killed the engine, exhausted from hours of driving, and stepped into the cold air. The front desk was exactly what I expected. A worn countertop, flickering overhead light, and a clerk who looked like he hadn't moved in years. He handed me a key, not saying much beyond the room number, 6. It felt more like a warning than a welcome. I walked the short hallway, each step swallowed by silence. Something about the air felt off, too dense, like it carried the weight of things left unsaid. Room 6 waited at the end, the door slightly warped, like it had been forced shut too many times. Inside, the room smelled faintly of bleach. The bed sat perfectly made, the tight sheets pulled with military precision, yet dust coated everything else, like no one had touched the place in a long time. A single dim lamp in the corner flickered, just enough to show the dull wallpaper peeling at the edges. But the thing that caught my attention immediately was the mirror. It stretched across the wall above the dresser, oversized and unsettling. It reflected the room accurately, but it felt wrong, like it was watching, waiting for something I hadn't noticed yet. I tried to shrug off the unease, telling myself I was just tired. I set my bag on the bed and sat down, the mattress groaning softly beneath me. The silence wrapped around the room again, pressing in from all sides. I glanced toward the mirror, and that's when I saw it. The reflection wasn't quite in sync. My movements mirrored back, but there was a fraction of a second's delay, just enough to notice. I lifted my hand, slowly, and the reflection followed. A beat too late. My chest tightened. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, exhaustion messing with me. But that knot of unease only tightened further. The lamp flickered again, and I shut my eyes, trying to block it all out. To sleep, I told myself. Morning will come soon enough. But sleep didn't come. Something shifted in the room. The air grew heavier, thicker, like I was no longer alone. I sat up, heart thudding, and glanced toward the mirror. My reflection stood there, perfectly still, but I hadn't moved. The figure in the mirror stared back at me, wearing my face, but it wasn't me. It blinked once, slowly, almost thoughtfully. A grin spread across its face, a grin I knew I wasn't making. I shot to my feet, backing toward the door. The reflection didn't follow. It just stood there, smiling that strange, knowing smile. I fumbled with the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. The metal was cold and unmoving, as if welded shut. I looked back at the mirror, and the reflection moved. It took a step forward, pressing its hand against the inside of the glass. The surface rippled, soft like water disturbed by the slightest touch. Then, without a sound, the figure disappeared. The mirror now reflected only the empty room. No bed, no lamp, no me. Just the same dull wallpaper and silence, as if I had never existed at all. The doorknob finally gave, and I yanked it open, stumbling into the hallway. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. The man at the front desk didn't even look up as I dropped the room key onto the counter and walked out. The neon sign buzzed on, flickering weakly in the distance as I left the motel behind. I didn't look back. I found the trail by accident, buried at the edge of the forest like it didn't want to be noticed. There was no sign, no marker, just a narrow gap between the trees where the ground dipped into a rough, uneven path. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd brought, but it looked like it led somewhere, and curiosity got the better of me. The sky was still bright, and I figured I had time to explore before heading back to camp. I stepped off the main trail and started down the unmarked path, feeling the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. The forest grew denser almost immediately, swallowing the sounds of the outside world. The air shifted, quieter, heavier, as if I'd crossed some invisible boundary without realizing it. After walking for about an hour, I spotted something strange. Tracks. They were boot prints, deep and clear, pressed into the dirt as if someone had come through not long ago. They led in the same direction I was going, but I hadn't passed anyone. I followed them without thinking, wondering who else had found this hidden trail. The farther I went, the less familiar everything felt. The trees grew taller, the branches thicker, blocking out the sun. The forest closed in tight, and I lost all sense of direction. I checked my phone for the GPS, but the signal was gone. No map, no compass, just the dwindling daylight pressing in around me. I kept going, telling myself I'd find something, an opening, a landmark, anything that looked like a way back. The tracks kept winding deeper, like they were guiding me somewhere. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, nestled between two crooked trees, was my tent. The same tent I had set up earlier, hours away from where I stood. I froze, staring at it, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The zipper was open slightly, the same way I'd left it, as if I'd just stepped out for a moment. My pack was there, along with the water bottle I'd been drinking from earlier that morning. But I hadn't been here. I knew that. I approached the tent cautiously, my heart pounding against my ribs. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I knelt down and peeked inside, half expecting to find something, or someone, waiting for me. Nothing. Just my gear, untouched. It was like the forest had rearranged itself around me, dragging my campsite across the miles without a trace. I stood, gripping the tent's fabric, trying to steady my breath. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling from the trees behind me, slow and deliberate, like something moving toward me through the undergrowth. I turned slowly, heart hammering in my chest. There, standing between the trees, was a shape, a silhouette that looked exactly like me. It stared back, head tilted slightly to one side, as if curious. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there waiting. I backed away from the tent, my legs unsteady. The figure stayed where it was, but somehow I knew it wasn't going to leave. It was waiting for me to make the next move. I grabbed my pack, turned and ran, back down the trail, back the way I thought I had come. The forest blurred around me, branches clawing at my clothes as the trees pressed in tighter, forcing me deeper into their maze. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I realized the tracks were still there, my own boot prints leading me in circles. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the silhouette again, but there was nothing, just the endless path, looping endlessly through the forest, with no end in sight. And that's when I knew there was no way out. We'd been walking along the coastline for about an hour, following the narrow strip of wet sand where the waves kissed the shore. The breeze was sharp, carrying the briny scent of the ocean, and the sky above had already begun to shift into evening, streaked with purples and oranges. It was quiet, just the sound of our boots and the distant crash of the waves. Emma stopped suddenly and pointed to the ground. Next to our footprints, running parallel to them, were fresh tracks. "Who else is out here?" she asked, scanning the empty shoreline. There wasn't a soul in sight. The cliffs behind us blocked any path from the mainland, and the beach ahead stretched into nothing but more sand and water. The footprints ran right alongside ours, close enough that it seemed like someone had been walking with us the entire time. But we'd been alone. We were sure of it. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone was walking earlier, and the tide just missed their tracks. Emma shook her head. The footprints were too fresh, the edges sharp in the damp sand, as though they had been made just moments ago. We kept walking, though the unease settled deep in my chest. Each time I glanced down, the other set of footprints was still there, moving right beside ours, matching us step for step. The sky dimmed further, and the beach grew narrower as the tide started to come in. We decided to pitch the tent just above the waterline, figuring we could head back first thing in the morning. As we set up camp, I noticed something strange. There were more footprints. They circled the area where we stood, spiraling around the tent and crisscrossing our own tracks. They were everywhere, as if someone or something had been pacing around us without ever making a sound. Emma's eyes locked on mine. "We've been alone, right?" I nodded, though the certainty I had earlier was slipping away fast. That night, we huddled inside the tent, listening to the waves roll in and out. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the thought of those footprints gnawed at me. At some point in the night, I heard it, the faint crunch of sand, as if someone was moving just outside the tent. I sat up, straining to listen, and heard it again. Deliberate steps, slow and measured, circling around us. Emma stirred beside me. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, stomach tight with dread. The sound continued, soft, steady, never rushing. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. The beach was empty, but the sand was covered in new footprints, circling the tent again, dozens of them overlapping in a perfect ring. I zipped the tent shut, heart racing, trying to keep my breath steady. "We leave first thing." Emma didn't argue. When morning finally came, we scrambled to pack up and leave. The moment we stepped out of the tent, we noticed it. The footprints didn't stop at the beach. They led inland toward the cliffs. We followed them, thinking they'd just disappear, that maybe it was nothing. But they kept going, winding along the cliffs and leading straight to the road where our car was parked. And that's when it hit me. We hadn't been to the beach yet that day, but the footprints were already waiting for us here. The night stretched long and empty as I drove along the back roads of southern Nevada, my GPS flickering between directions and a no-signal message. I was miles from the nearest town, with nothing but my headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The road was so desolate it felt like I was the last person on Earth, just me and the hum of my engine. I glanced at the dashboard. Midnight. There were still hours to go before I'd reach the small, run-down motel I'd booked along the highway. The road ahead twisted like a coiled snake, with no end in sight, and the landscape around me was flat and endless, an ocean of black sand and dry scrub. Then out of nowhere, a burst of static filled the truck's cab, and a voice crackled through the walkie-talkie sitting on my passenger seat. "Hey, you out there?" The voice asked, calm and low, as if it already knew I was listening. I stared at the walkie-talkie in disbelief. I didn't own one, had never touched it before, and I sure as hell hadn't brought it with me. It must have been left in the rental truck by the last driver. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, just pretending I hadn't heard anything. But curiosity gnawed at me. I picked it up, thumb hovering over the button, and hesitated. The night outside seemed darker now, the road narrower, as if the walls of night were closing in. Before I could respond, the voice spoke again. "I know you can hear me. You're on County Route 36, right?" The voice was steady, casual, too casual. It knew exactly where I was. I dropped the walkie-talkie like it burned my skin, and it clattered onto the seat. A sick sense of unease crawled into my chest, knotting tight beneath my ribs. I hadn't passed anyone for miles. No houses, no cars. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning pale. I kept my eyes pinned to the road, willing the walkie-talkie to stay silent. "You need to keep moving," the voice instructed, cutting through the static. "Do not stop." My heart drummed harder, thudding against my ribs like a warning. How did they know where I was? And why told me not to stop? I wanted to respond, demand answers, but fear glued my hands to the wheel. The landscape blurred past in the darkness as I pressed my foot harder on the gas. The truck's engine growled, climbing higher and higher into the gears. Every instinct screamed at me to listen to that voice. As ridiculous as it was, but a voice coming from a walkie-talkie that shouldn't even be there. I told myself it was a prank, some freak coincidence, even though I knew deep down it wasn't. Then I saw it. A car parked haphazardly by the side of the road, its windows shattered and body scarred with dents. It looked like it had been sitting there for a while, forgotten in the middle of nowhere. Something about it was off. The headlights were dark, the front tire flat, and yet the sight of it made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Against my better judgment, I slowed down as I passed the car. That's when I saw the most unsettling detail. The driver's door was open, hanging ajar, and there was no one inside. Just an empty seat and shattered glass sparkling on the asphalt. The walkie-talkie crackled again, startling me. I glanced down at it. "Do not stop," the voice repeated, sterner this time. "They never make it if they stop." A knot of cold fear settled in my gut. The road felt like it was folding in on itself, twisting deeper into some place that wasn't meant to be found. I kept driving, faster now, my foot heavy on the pedal. The truck's headlights clawed at the darkness, but no matter how far I went, the road kept stretching endlessly ahead, as if it would never end. Almost there, the voice whispered through the static, oddly soothing. "Just don't stop, no matter what you see." I wanted to scream, to hurl the walkie-talkie out the window, but the fear had taken root inside me. It wasn't just the road or the strange voice. It was the way everything around me seemed wrong, as if the landscape had shifted just slightly off-kilter. Then, in the distance, I saw it, another abandoned car identical to the first. Same model, same shattered windows. The driver's door swung wide open, as if waiting for me. Panic gripped me hard, twisting my thoughts into tangled knots. I slammed on the gas, the engine roaring as I sped past. I knew, without a doubt, that if I stopped, I wouldn't be leaving that place alive. The voice spoke one last time, quieter now, almost drowned out by the static. "They never make it, not if they stop." And then silence. The walkie-talkie went dead, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the endless stretch of road. I drove through the night, never slowing, never daring to pull over, even as exhaustion gnawed at the edges of my mind. When the first pink slivers of dawn began to light the horizon, I finally saw the neon sign of the motel flickering in the distance. I pulled into the parking lot, heart still hammering in my chest. The sense of relief should have washed over me, but it didn't. As I climbed out of the truck, I glanced into the back seat. The walkie-talkie was gone.